In this video, I want to look at Gareth Evans's argument found in his paper, Can There Be Vague Objects? The typical way of thinking about vagueness and indeterminacy is that vagueness and indeterminacy is found in our language. It's found in how we describe or represent the world. It's not found in the world itself. But some individuals contend that there's vagueness in the world, that is, there's fuzzy objects, that is, there's ontological indeterminacy. If that's the case, then when we go to describe the world, vagueness is not merely found in our language, but it's found in the objects that we're describing. If that's the case, then there should be sentences for which it's true to say it is indeterminate that P, and P is simply a placeholder for some vague fact about the world. So suppose there are fuzzy objects, that is, there are vague objects in the world. If that's the case, then it seems true to say that a sentence like A equals B is indeterminate. The idea here is that if there is an object that we're calling A, then it should be indeterminate whether or not that object is identical to another object that we're calling B. It should be unclear whether or not A and B not simply refer to the same thing, but actually are the same thing. Evans's argument tries to show that this assumption is absurd. It leads to contradiction. So I want to walk through Evans's argument step by step, and I want to do it in a non-technical way. Let's start with line 1. Line 1 states that it is indeterminate whether or not A equals B. In other words, what line 1 says is that if there are vague objects, then it should be indeterminate whether or not an object A is identical to another object B. That is, it should be fuzzy whether or not these two things are the same thing or not. Moving to line 2 expresses a fact about object B. It says that B has a particular property, and this property is being indeterminately identical to A. So just as a ball can be red, a person can be tall, B has the property of being indeterminately identical to A. Moving to line 3, people take it to be a determinate truth that everything is identical to itself. So it's determinately true that A equals A. Now what line 3 does is it expresses this in a different way. It says that it is not indeterminate that A equals A. And this seems to make sense since everything is identical to itself. It wouldn't be the case that some object would not be identical to itself. Our reasoning from line 3 to line 4 mirrors the reasoning we did when we reasoned from line 1 to line 2. Line 4 states a particular property about A. It says that A has the property of not being indefinitely identical to A. In other words, what can we say about A? Well, one thing we can say about A is that it lacks a particular property. It lacks the property of being indefinitely identical to itself. Now line 5 is the conclusion. The conclusion states that by Leibniz's laws, lines 2 and 4, we reason to the conclusion that it is not the case that A equals B. Okay, so what does Leibniz's laws say? Leibniz's laws say that for any property P and any objects X and Y, if X and Y are identical, then if X has the property P, then Y is going to have that property P. In other words, if two things are identical, then they're going to have the same properties. So what does Leibniz's laws, lines 2 and line 4 tell us? Well, if you look at line 2 tells us a particular property about B. It says that B has a property of being indefinitely identical to A. And line 4 tells us that A lacks this property. In other words, B has a property that A lacks. And since Leibniz's laws say that if two things are identical and if one object has a property, then the other one will have it, the conclusion is that A and B are not identical to each other. When you take a look at the conclusion is in conflict with our original assumption. Our original assumption stated that it is indeterminate whether or not A equals B, but our conclusion states not that it is indeterminate whether or not A equals B, but it is not the case that A equals B. So we've reasoned from this assumption to a conclusion that is inconsistent with it. So in summary, if there are vague objects, if vagueness is found in the world rather than our description of things, then it should be true to say of some sentences that it is indeterminate that A equals B. But what Evans's argument shows is that if we assume that that's the case, if we assume it is indeterminate that A equals B, we reason to a contradiction. And if that's the case, then it must not be true to say that it is indeterminate that A equals B. And if that is the case, then vagueness is not found in the world. That is, there are no vague objects. And insofar as vagueness does exist, it must be found in our language rather than things themselves. So in short, Evans asks, can there be vague objects? And the answer to that is no.